Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Nobel Laureate Michael Spence, who is a professor at the Stern School of Business at NYU and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. His new book is The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World. Professor Spence, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you, Harry. It's nice to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in New Jersey. My mother did that on purpose, but my family's Canadian, and I grew up in Canada, Ottawa during the war, Winnipeg, and then Toronto.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
My father was an intellectual, and although he kept sort of straying off into business, I think he would have been a better academic. But they pushed the life of the intellect, and that caused me to at least give an academic career a shot, and it worked out pretty well for me.
And was there a lot of discussion about economic issues at the dinner table, politics, world events?
There was quite a bit. You know, they were readers and knowledgeable. I think the thing I missed is we probably didn't talk as much as I would have liked about the things my father was seeing day to day. He was a relatively taciturn man. But he taught me mathematics at a very young age, and that turned out to be useful.
And where then did you do your undergraduate work and graduate work?
So after high school, I came to Princeton. And I did that because in Canada in those days, we had the English system, and it really didn't have the liberal arts feature. And I thought there are a lot of subjects I'd like to study. And I was a hockey player, and Princeton seemed interested in that. And then I went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and did my PhD in economics at Harvard.
Mm-hmm. And what was your dissertation on?
It was called Market Signaling. So it was the work for which I got to receive the Nobel Prize in the company of your colleague, George Akerlof and Joe Stiglitz. We all were interested in markets with incomplete and asymmetric information. And my part was, well, how do markets respond to that, and how well do they, quote, fix the problem?
And what was creativity like in this process of this research as an economist and then somebody who is kind of on the cutting edge of research?
Well, you know, I mean, I think the main thing you have to do is to have a little bit of self-confidence and a little bit of risk-taking. I mean, if you go off and study something, it says George and Joe and I are viewed now as sort of together, but we weren't working together. George was here. He and Joe had been at MIT. Joe, I can't remember where he was exactly at that time, and I was at Harvard, and I didn't know either of them until later. So I think the three critical ingredients: take some risk, and if it doesn't work out, you know, it's not the end of your life. You just used up a little time. Do something unconventional, and to do that, you really need the support of your advisors. I mean, if your advisors say that's too risky, you know, do something more conventional, get a job, and you can do that later, then that would probably stop anybody. It would have stopped me, but they didn't say that, so I'm grateful to them.
What is the skill base, if you were talking to a group of students going into economics, what should they be learning that is beyond the usual formula? Because in your new book that we're going to talk about, a lot of it is about actually going out and observing what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think good advisors and sound strategy for students is get out of your discipline, get into the adjacent ones that are arguably sort of studying the same thing or a different thing, but only slightly different, so that where the boundaries occur, you get cognitive dissonance and you see there's a challenge. Maybe these two lenses for seeing the world are both valuable. I think getting out and getting some experience is good. And also, you know, it's very important not to accept the current agenda of the discipline as defined now. If you want to do something original, then eventually you're going to alter the agenda. Not replace it, not this is wrong, but add to it. And so I think just getting clear about that so you don't have to look for your research topics somewhere in this edifice that's already been built.
What led you to focus on information and market structure in that work? Was it just what was going on in the world, or what?
Yeah, it was partly that. So the part of economics I love is to look at something in the world that I don't understand and then try to understand it better, frequently by developing a conceptual apparatus that's useful for it, and then sharing that with others. And I sort of, if something that seemed complicated seems simple after people hear about it, then you think you've probably succeeded a bit. No, it's sort of an accident. I mean, the Kennedy School was just starting at Harvard, and I almost quit because I was tired of being in libraries. And Dick Zeckhauser, one of my advisors, just a wonderful guy and a terrific mind, one of the best bridge players in the United States. He said, well, you could teach, and by the way, we're having a faculty seminar. It's kind of part of the way we're building the Kennedy School. And he said, you can be the rapporteur. And it was amazing. I mean, it was, Ken Arrow and Francis Bathor and Dick Neustadt and Tom Schelling and, talking about a different subject every week. And my job was to make it seem like a really coherent, just brilliant discussion from beginning to end. Kind of like what you do, Harry. and to this day, Ken Arrow thinks that's my main skill, is being a rapporteur. And he jokes about it all the time with me. And in that, there were a lot of interesting subjects. One of them was statistical discrimination. It was the Vietnam War era. And people were starting to think about things that really weren't so good in society. And somewhere in there, I picked up this notion that markets really have these additional structural characteristics. And one of them is that buyers don't know what they're buying exactly. Mm-hmm. I did then read George Akerlof's Lemons paper at Tom Schelling's suggestion, and that was an eye-opener for me, and then I went from there.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, this rapporteur function that you just mentioned, it's about listening and sort of capturing the intellectual excitement of new ideas?
Yes, and delivering it back so it sounds coherent. I mean, you can just imagine the difference between a well-done rapporteur's report and the transcript of the actual 2 hours. It took me ages. I'd spend 2-3 days writing up a 10-page summary, try to capture the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were later dean at Stanford Business School, when you left that position, you took on the job of chairing a commission, the Commission on Growth and Development.
Right.
Talk about that, because it's a very interesting story of a learning process, really.
For me, it was. Again, there's so many things in life that are accidents, Harry. So I was minding my own business, thinking the internet was going to have a pretty big effect on the world of economics, and the global economy, and I had figured out, I think, that one of the bigger areas of impact would be the places that were remote from the centers of economic activity, the developing countries historically. And somewhere along the line, Roberto Zaga, who's now a very good friend and the head of the World Bank in India, phoned me up. I didn't know him. And he was in Washington, and then he said, would you give the main keynote lecture at the Prem conference in 2005 on growth? And I thought, well, I'm kind of interested in that, but that's, 10,000 people who know a lot more about this subject than I do in developing countries, so maybe it's not a good idea. So I asked them, I said, why me? And they said, well, you've thought about this from an investment point of view. You're more microeconomically oriented, and growth has sort of slipped away in the agenda. And so I said, okay, I'll give it a try. I used the informational asymmetry work. I thought, this is a screening device. Mm-hmm. If I do it and it goes badly, I'll have learned something and I ought to do something else. And if it goes okay, then we can go. And that turned into the Growth Commission, and they knew a lot of people, and I knew a few. And we basically assembled a group of people who were political and policy leaders, mostly in developing countries, the vast majority of them. People who had accomplished a lot, who'd fought a lot of battles, won some, lost some. And we asked them, I said, would you like to participate in this, and is this an interesting exercise? It was sort of a screening device again. And they said yes. And so we formed a commission that was with some support from the World Bank, the Hewlett Foundation here in California, several governments, the UK, the Dutch government, and so on. And And we set out basically, and I'll just make this brief, to figure out what we'd learned from experience about growth in developing countries and from academic research, put them all together, and try to deliver something that's kind of readable and useful back to the policymakers and the political leaders in the developing world.
Mm-hmm. And in the introduction to your book, let me show your book again, The Next Convergence, you have two starting points. One is your sense and the Commission's growing sense of the impact of the Internet. Talk a little about that, because this was, you suspected and then I guess demonstrated that this was a powerful motor force in what was happening in the world.
It is. I mean, it's part, if you think of the world as integrating by policy and technology and learning and know-how, this is the technology part, and it really is powerful. So, I mean, just take two dimensions. We have, if you're going to run a global supply chain, you know, in any business, you've got to control it. And in the old days, you had manufacturing moving to developing countries when the world opened up in the sense of the GATT. But, you know, there was lots of inefficiency. I mean, this took from deciding you wanted a product to getting it all done and whatnot, take 18 months, the product cycle. It's down to 3 to 6 now. What the Internet did is it allowed the efficient management of global supply chains, you know. So if like an iPod or an iPad has chips coming from that are designed for it, coming from Japan, Taiwan, Korea. It's got other stuff coming from where it's assembled in China. You know, the design work's being done in the United States, except for some of the chip design. You know, there's a lot of people scattered around the place, and you have to get them organized. And now, of course, we have the other thing, which is we have the direct delivery of services that are knowledge and information intensive on the Internet on a global basis. And those two things by themselves are just almost transforming with respect to the opportunities and integration in the global economy.
The other caveat at the beginning of the book is that you point to the story of the dot-com boom, and you say, okay, there are these possibilities here, but we have to watch how long this will take. And you're saying, I think, that you have to understand history and organizations, because it ain't necessarily going to happen as quickly as one thinks.
No, that's right. I think of that as something that we learn and then forget repeatedly. Yeah, I think I mentioned it in the book, but the late Zvi Grilius, who was a great econometrician, one of the builders of econometrics and economics, did one of his most famous papers on the diffusion of hybrid corn in the American West. Hybrid corn was, you know, an important innovation. It took 20, 30 years to sort of get scattered around. Mm-hmm. And this is the same, only it's not just information and adoption, it's sort of learning how to use the technology that we kind of underestimated in the dot-com bubble. So we just got overvaluations. But I think some people concluded from that, not experts, but some people thought, well, that was a bubble, you know, pure and simple, came and it went. Mm-hmm. But it had this lingering effect, which is, you know, this was real. It just, we got the timing wrong.
One of the reasons for your book is to focus on this interface between the emerging economies and the advanced economies. And that's where the book ends up. But to get there, you help us understand what exactly is going on in the emerging economies and what is the problem set that they have to confront. And this is all about the new forms of economic growth. Help us understand the major problem that an emerging economy, a Brazil, a China, have to confront.
Well, you know, that's a wonderful question. I'll be brief. First of all, in the post-war period, the emerging economies were given three things. The colonial empires, were dismantled, and so the built-in asymmetries, we do this and you supply this stuff, raw materials and stuff, it was taken away. So they were free in some sense to go their own way. Second, a bunch of very, very wise people decided not to repeat the post-World War I experience of crushing the vanquished, as it produced disastrous results, and instead set off on a course. They almost certainly didn't understand the full dimensions. I wouldn't have. And they created a structure that turned out to be just enormously beneficial to everybody, to the recovering countries in the war, after the war, but eventually to the emerging economies. So this open global economy, constructed by a combination of technology and far-sighted policy, gives a developing country two things. It gives them knowledge that we've accumulated over a couple of hundred years since the British Industrial Revolution, and if we and they can find a way to transfer it in, their potential output rises at a tremendous speed, at speeds you've never seen before, 7 to 10%. To take advantage of that, you have to do two things. You have to invest and save at high rates, which sounds simple, except for if I propose to you, who at the time might have a family income of $500 a year, that maybe we shouldn't spend a third of that, and invest it in the future of our children and grandchildren together, right? You might think twice before agreeing to that proposition, because there's a big difference between $500 and $350 or $340. So the successful countries make an enormously impressive sacrifice in the present to create this growth engine that ultimately benefits them when it's fast enough, but mostly their children and grandchildren. So very high investment and savings rates. And then the other thing, final thing the global economy gives you, and you've got most of the moving parts except the governance, is if you look at a developing economy in the early stage of growth when it's still relatively poor, and look at the demand side of its economy, it's just not interesting. I mean, you're not going to make a whole lot of apparel and shoes for a market that's sort of poor and spending most of its money on shelter and food. So you need a market. And the global economy, of course, is a gift. I mean, you build yourself up to a 1% market share, grow at 100%, and now you got a 2% market share if the global economy didn't grow. I mean, you cannot exhaust the global economy's capacity to consume relative to your size. And so the demand side doesn't slow you down. This is what Adam Smith meant, is a dynamic version of specialization is limited by the extent of the market. So the extent of the market in the global economy is just infinite. And so those two things, and you start this engine running, and you can grow in catch-up mode, catching up with us technologically and so on, for a long period of time. You start out poor, it'll take, even at high-speed growth rates, 50, 60 years to make this journey.
Now, in taking advantage of this opportunity, political leadership seems to be key in two senses. One, realizing this possibility, and then on the other hand, being prepared to transition to the next stage.
All right.
Talk a little about that. You use the example of China, where the Deng Xiaoping actually brought American economists over to explain to the leaders of the party what needed to be done.
Yeah, no, well, they'd already made the decision to change direction because they were failing. Yeah, China, I mean, China's a good case, right? So in the Communist Revolution, Mao and his colleagues took over. They did some good things. They educated people in a way that's very unusual in a poor country. Almost 90% of men and women were literate, and that was done before the reforms. It was a country, this is crucial, it turns out, where the leadership had, whatever you think of their performance, the intent to make the vast majority of people better off than they were. As opposed to countries where something's gone wrong. They're either autocratic or some pathology in democracy where a group is acting on its own behalf or on behalf of a subset. That second class of cases, that's just fatal to growth. There are no high growth cases in that. So they had two fairly important prerequisites, but they did not have enough freedom to operate economically, and they had a disastrous, closed-in economic model. Everything I just said to you about the global economy was missing. And essentially, one way to see about the Deng Xiaoping reforms in the around 1978 was they decided to fill in the missing pieces. So they gave people enough economic freedom to operate, let the market system run with the incentives it created, and they picked the right open to the global economy model. And the way I encountered this other thing you referred to is that Deng Xiaoping asked McNamara, who was then head of the World Bank, for the first time in the World Bank's history, to come to China, and I know some of the people who went with him, 2 or 3. And he sat them down and he said, you know, we can probably, you're a bank, but we don't mainly want money. He said, we can probably muddle through and do this, but the truth is we don't know much about running a market economy, and so we would like some instruction, and we want to learn quickly. Can you help? And that's when the, American professors, late Jim Tobin, the leaders of our field, went to try to be helpful, and they gave lectures, and the Chinese did it geometrically. There'd be 20 people listening, and they took notes, and then those 20 would do 20 more, and this has characterized Chinese growth all along. But there's a lot of people who don't like aspects of the way China is governed and deals with people, but it is, in my experience, the highest speed learning environment I've ever been in, and that story, it's a true story about Deng Xiaoping, is he understood that this was really about learning, not mainly about bricks and mortar and bridges and factories.
You make the point that the key element in policy making in the emerging economy is understanding the importance of people versus the importance of jobs. And this becomes, jobs are important, but jobs come and go as the economy transitions.
Yes.
Help us understand that, because it's a very important point. So you have to not try to save jobs that become out of date as you develop a new middle class.
That's right. So yeah, all over the place, you have to first learn this and then accept it. So that you actually have two demands. You have structural change that's continuous, and is almost the same thing as the growth, Harry. If you stall a structural change, the growth will go away. And it occurs at all levels. People flowing into cities. You're building cities in China. They build Los Angeles every year, approximately. It's new jobs. It's new companies. Some of them come. Some of them die off. It's new industries. It's new universities. It's the depopulating of the rural area because there was surplus labor there. Everywhere, there's this high-speed change. And there's a lot of transition. So part of the concept, the idea of inclusiveness, is everybody has a shot at this. They have to accept that not everybody will get into the modern economy at the same time, because there will be some inequality, but you have to manage it. And you certainly have to protect people, when this economy that you can think of as a high-speed machine sort of sideswipes them. And that's done well or badly, but if you don't have anything. Now, the mistake that gets made is you protect them by protecting the company or the industry or the job. And if you do that, the Europeans did that in the post-war period because they have a more protective approach to social policy than we have traditionally had, but they implemented it by protecting companies and industries, and this company's the major employer in this town, so we'll keep it, as opposed to people. And all the successful cases gravitate eventually to protecting people directly and letting the engine run, and the other things come and go.
And so what they have to do is balance the job destruction with job creation.
Correct. As
they move to producing new kinds of things and exporting different kinds of products.
Yeah, and probably the scariest, if I can put it that way, transition is the one that China's now entering, which is called the middle-income transition. Because that's the point, where your incomes are up around $4,000. There's countries in the global economy that are still down around 1,000, 1,500 or lower. And so at 4,000 to 5,000 and rising rapidly, you're not going to be the low labor cost place anymore in labor-intensive process-oriented manufacturing. So it doesn't happen overnight, but you got to let it go. And that means you got to let it go, the thing that you thought was the main sort of employment engine for the rural sector as you entered the modern economy in the early days. So you've got to let go of the thing you thought was the growth model, and then let the economy deepen its human capital, deepen its sort of intellectual resources, and move to a different sort of stage of development, different part of the value-added chain in a way. And because, I sometimes describe this as probably the biggest mistake that gets made is to think you've got the right formula and then do it too long. Because nothing's permanent. So the tendency is you have both interest groups that want to protect this, and you've got this generalized fear that it won't be replaced by anything, and one has to overcome both of those, and that isn't always successful. I mean, the number of countries that have gone through the middle-income transition at high speeds up till now is only 5.
What do you see as the central characteristic of the different leaders you encountered that made this transition possible? Because what you're talking about is an age-old problem: invested interests, political leaders tied to those vested interests, and not being able to take the next step, and then things unravel.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to be very precise about that. But I think the people that impressed me most were the ones that first understood that they had to collect people and kind of build a sense of unity around a vision, and sometimes with a terrible starting point. I mean, take Nelson Mandela. I mean, he inherited a country that by all rights should have torn itself apart given its history, and instead somehow managed to produce a group of people who are proud to be South Africans, proud to be in charge, could see through his eyes, in part, the future that they had together. And it's an amazing thing. And there's elements of that, I think, in all the successful cases. Then you have to pick the right model, or you have to get enough good people around you. Humility doesn't hurt. I don't know all the answers. I'll get some people to help me, and we'll put together a sort of long-term plan. You have to have long time horizons. And then if you're in a democratic setting, you have to figure out a way to implement that, in a system that is inherently forces some short-term considerations, namely getting elected. And no, you put all that together. I mean, if you can accomplish those things, good people, right strategy, sense of unity around a vision, inclusiveness, you've done an awful lot.
So the problem is really managing success, because you really have to do all of these things at a point where you're succeeding. It's just that you've got to change the agenda. Yeah,
that's right. But you do have to get it started. I mean, you get stuck in a low-level equilibrium and people say, well, yeah, I know you say we should invest more, but, I don't think it'll work. Or they're not going to go along with it or something. You just get stuck. I think some people like Jeff Sachs think the traps are economic, and he may be right. I think they're political economic. I think you can't, when you're in a very poor country in certain cases, you just can't get the governance right, or you can't get the motion started at the start. But then you got to keep it up.
One of your central points, and I think you're trying to deal with this problem of why what you've just described is important for the advanced economies that have already gone in the past through this process. And what you're saying is that these emerging economies have done so well up to this point that they really have an impact now on the global structure.
Yeah, I think this is the crossroads. I mean, we're within a few years, less than 10, of having the developing economies in the aggregate be more than half the global economy, even without purchasing power parity adjustments and so on. You know, that China is the second largest economy if you don't count Europe as one. It's about 10 years away from being pretty near our size in aggregate, right? Not per capita income, but in the aggregate. You know, Asia has 3.8 billion people, or 60% of the world's population, slightly less. And, you know, it's the place where most of the growth is going to occur. It's got the two future economic giants, China and India. India also in high growth mode now. And so if you drop back vis-a-vis what you were talking about, China 25 years ago was in the early stages of its high-speed growth period and reform, was growing at 10%, but it didn't make a bit of difference in the global economy. It was minuscule. Now, but if you'd run this engine for 31 years, you get a pretty big economy. And now when they grow at 10%, you know, it's a good chunk of the world's growth, especially with us struggling along in the post-crisis period. So yes, I wrote this now partly because I thought it was interesting, you know, to see how this worked in the post-war period, but also because it's the time when their impact on the global economy and us is larger, and we now have to share the reins of power with respect to global governance and manage this whole thing we're in together.
What do you see as the responsibilities of the leaders of these emerging economies once they recognize what you just described, namely the impact of what they're doing? So they're managing this domestic transition, and then I guess it would be helpful to understand what it is they have to see about their responsibilities toward the global economy. One of the issues, obviously, is when they accumulate large savings. This poses a problem to the system. That's one example. If they have fixed exchange rates, then they're not adapting to the changes required as they face outward to the global economy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you said it very, very well. First, they have to recognize that the simple fact that they've gotten big enough to have systemic effects in the global economy, including big external ones. And the second thing is that they have to then learn how to trade off, when necessary, global interests in stability and fairness and other things against their growth and development agenda, so they can't be as narrowly focused with blinkers on as they were before. Or they can, but it's not a good idea, and in the case of the big economies like China, it's not in their self-interest. And the good news is they know this. So China is in almost unique position. It's the only country that's come anywhere near having global systemic importance at a per capita income of $4,000. It's never happened before. So there's a subset of people in China, including policymakers, who think, you know, that's way too poor to be having global responsibilities. Let's set that aside for another 10 years. We'll just focus on this. And the wiser people in China and sympathetic external advisors, and who they consult frequently, come in and say, you know, that's an understandable instinct, but it's not in your self-interest. You know, with the exchange rate, you can, if managed improperly, unbalance the system. If you do something unexpected with your $3 trillion of reserves, you could put a major upset into the global financial system. And truth is, the Chinese know this, so it's not in their interest to do this. So it's learning how to discharge the responsibilities and make those trade-offs that's on their agenda now.
We said at the beginning and in your book, you're struggling with this interface between the emerging economies and the advanced economies. Let's talk a little about that. In the period, the first stages of this growth that you're talking about, we had something called the Washington Consensus that you discussed, that basically were a set of rules that may have been misinterpreted, but that were generally applied. And you say in the book that one of the things you learned as part of the commission was how the different setting led to different adjustments, so that what was apparent in the success of these countries were adaptations, experiments that weren't in the kind of Washington consensus formula. So talk a little about that, because really we're in a period where this adaptation has to be recognized, and we essentially have to move to a new framework, but the advanced economies aren't necessarily ready to accept that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, so the successful, it revolves around the role of government. So John Williamson produced the Washington Consensus. He's a very smart man, and it was entirely sensible. If you read it, you think, yep, those are the key ingredients in high growth. 15 years later, John did that around 1990, late 80s. 15 years later, with a lot of experience, we can add and subtract from them, but you certainly wouldn't say they were wrong. They were misapplied. They were stripped down to sort of, privatize everything, liberalize, meaning open up immediately, let markets determine everything. And lots of experience tells us that doesn't work, that you have to be more cautious and gradual, that this is a process, not, a big bang. And the successful countries find different paths, partly because they have different circumstances and histories. Latin America has a legacy of the colonial period where the assets are owned by very small numbers of people. Huge amounts of income inequality, even today, and while they're going in the right direction. I mean, the good news about Brazil is it's back to high growth mode in an inclusive way, and the Gini coefficient, which is the standard measure of income inequality, is coming down. But it was above 0.6. I mean, excuse me. So what I learned, to kind of put it in a nutshell, is that the ideological approach to what the role of the government and what the role of markets is doesn't work. It's different for different countries, and you got to find your own way down the middle. Everybody knows the markets and capitalism are the driving force, and decentralization, because the centrally planned things didn't work. But the government has an enormously important complementary role as investor in human capital, as investor in infrastructure, as adapter to the speed of openness and so on. And the successful economies aren't all in the same place, but they're somewhere navigating with imperfect charts in that middle. And so I think, and it's pragmatic, and it's experimental, and it's not ideological.
Now, this need for change, which your book beautifully explains, and I should say to our audience in a very simple and clear way that so one doesn't have to be an economist to actually learn here. This comes at a time after the 2008 failure of the global economy. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little about that, because at one hand, that collapse was an opportunity. Mm-hmm. We saw the emergence of the G20. But on the other hand, it represents a failure, I guess, of economic theory and of policy in the advanced economies. How does that impact the response that the advanced economies have to make to the emerging economy, and what should we be learning from the 2008 collapse to be able to do that?
Well, that's a very big agenda, Harry. I think first of all, I think there were exceptions, but I would include myself in the people who should be embarrassed and shocked at the incompleteness of the models we had of the financial sector and its dynamics and its potential to go this way and get way out of balance and eventually collapse. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to improve. I think it's additions rather than throwing stuff out. Now, in the emerging markets, they said, well, we never thought we should have an approach to economic policy that was the same as the advanced countries until we got to be the advanced countries. over a 50-year period. And now they're saying, well, kind of we don't know what that is because we have to reconstruct it a bit. Meanwhile, they did very well. I mean, they had learned from the 98 crisis. They had reserves. They had better leverage situations than we did in the public sector, government and private sector side. They didn't have, the toxic assets on the balance sheets. And so they took a big shock when the capital started flowing out and when trade fell off a cliff. Fortunately, trade came back and they handled the credit problem, as we did, really quite well. I mean, that was done well all over the world. And they bounced back. China, India, and Brazil, in that order, are back to pre-crisis growth rates. And they're doing it even as we limp along in Europe and America and Japan, which means they have achieved a greater degree of, they're not independent from us. If we take a nosedive, that will hurt, but a greater degree of independence and resilience. And they're pleased, they're happy. And I think they, think that the pragmatic, sort of slightly skeptical path and balancing, respect for market forces and prices and price signals with something a little more adapted to the state of their economy, what stage of development they're at. So this could have caused them to sort of throw over the market capitalist model on the ground it failed here initially in some form, and they didn't do that. They said, look, this is not a failure of markets and capitalism. It is a failure of the financial system that had dramatic effects. The last thing I'll say about this, is our interests and theirs are very much the same. They want us to restore growth and employment and be a cooperative player with respect to managing the global economy. And and they have an interest in getting their current account trade surplus down because they need the consumption to drive the growth now that we've, staged a partial exit.
The United States is confronting economic dilemmas in its policy that require us to make a kind of transition to essentially move away where we were in terms of the development of our economy. Talk a little about that. I know you mentioned earlier when we were talking before the interview that you've just written a piece. What happened to employment in the United States over the last couple of decades as we now confront this very high unemployment, which we're unable to get rid of?
Right. Well, we went back. Sandile Halachwayo and I. She's a talented young economist who's coming here to Berkeley next year. We looked at employment and value added per person, which is closely related to income in the American economy by sector. Fairly finely divided. And what we found is that the American economy managed to create, I think it was 27 million jobs. Man, that's a lot of jobs. But most of the employment creation, net, that's, in every sector you create and destroy jobs. So these are all net figures, increments. Virtually all of it was in the non-tradable sector where it's probably easiest to, but it's things that have to be, goods and services that have to be produced where they're consumed, plus or minus a bit. So the big sectors are on the non-tradable side are government, healthcare, construction. You have to build a building where the building's going to be built. Retail, big employer, restaurants, hotels, and so on. There's other employers, but those are the big ones, and probably together they accounted for 60% of that growth. The interesting thing is the tradable sector, grew quite nicely if you look at value added or just its top line, but it actually didn't generate any employment, and a subset of it, which we normally think of as manufacturing, actually declined in employment quite a bit, compensating for increases elsewhere in finance and computer design and whatnot. And so the net effect was no job growth. I mean, in some ways it's a miracle, Harry, that we created 27 million jobs without doing it on the tradable side of the economy. We did it with big growth in government and healthcare and some excess consumption. Mm-hmm. Now we've had the shock, and I think we probably aren't on that trajectory, and what would have shown up before is going to show up as an employment problem, but also an income distribution problem. Because what's happening is the global economy and other forces are affecting different parts of our income distribution differently, and the adverse effects in terms of income growth and employment options, you know, just the range of things you can choose from or choose to try to achieve, is the adverse effects seem to be in the middle income range. And I think it's an important challenge for us in America to go to work and think together about, you know, making the next 10, 20 years of the evolution of our economy and the global economy a more inclusive one for Americans.
And the important point here is, as you point out in the book and pieces that I've seen that you've written, is that we have to turn to the tradable sector to increase economic growth here and get over these high numbers in unemployment.
Yep.
So what is involved in doing that? Is it our policymakers making choices that build up the infrastructure, the talent, whatever, to make that sector bigger? And how do you go about doing that?
You may not be, let me just preface this by, I think there's a lot of things we can do, but I'm not sure you can get rid of all the distributional impacts of globalization. I mean, I literally don't know. So this isn't meant to be, if you do all these things, you know, you'll solve the problem. But let me say what I think. And then I think we ought to have an argument, you know, if we can bring it up and have a lot of inputs. But first of all, as a country, we underinvest, both on the public sector side and now on the private sector side, because we're aggregate demand short because of the consumption fall and because the slack hasn't been taken up by additional demand from the global economy. I think it's important, Harry, for your audience to understand the part of the tradable sector that we're in is very competitive. You know, finance, managing multinational enterprises, designing things, you know, consulting of a whole variety of kinds. I mean, these employ very talented people, and so we shouldn't, this is a strength. And it generates some domestic employment. So this isn't a, you know, woe is me kind of picture. It's a mixed picture. But as a country, we're underinvesting. And we're not saving enough to finance our investment. That's why we have a current account deficit, a persistent and too high one. And then if I had to be more precise, I'd say there's parts of the educational system that aren't very effective and aren't producing results in terms of cognitive skills. So one project would be to work even harder, and I know a lot of people are involved in this, in getting the whole system up to the standards that we normally apply in higher education in terms of performance and innovativeness and dynamics. We got to invest more in infrastructure. We ought to go look at the investment we make in the knowledge and technology base of the economy and see if we can augment it a bit or direct it into areas that are going to focus on the employment issue as opposed to what's interesting today or whatever. We, for sure, whatever you think of our environmental policies, we should have an energy policy that makes sense in a world in which the emerging economies are going to drive increasing demand and probably prices up. Not forever, because there's substitutes for some of this stuff, but that's the world we're going to live in. We were before the crisis. We're returning to it now. Accommodative monetary policy may accelerate this increase, but it's not the main event in the long run. And the tax system. You know, we probably ought to have a value-added tax, so that's controversy. We surely should simplify it. We should, you know, try to promote incentives for productive investment as opposed to just housing, which is privileged, and get rid of incentives to do the investing offshore, other than on the merits, because that's where a lot of the growth is. So there's just a whole lot of things that if we can get our attention focused on them will help us deal with these longer-term structural problems. And my main concern right now is we have a big enough fiscal problem that needs attention, and I wouldn't argue anything I just said should replace the focus on that. But I think that may be sufficiently difficult that we will just not get around to attending to some of these other things for a while.
At one point in the book, you raised the question, well, as these emerging economies move to the high value end, then what's left for us? And you use a friend had said something about the contact, the jobs that are like I'm forgetting exactly where.
No, Jim Gibbons called it a body contact sport.
Yeah, body contact. Talk a little about that, because there are some things which you just talked about that we do well and we need to continue doing, and they're not going to go elsewhere.
No, that's absolutely right. So I think the easiest way to think of it is skip the transitions, which are difficult, and jump to the end. So the question I get asked all the time is, well, if they're rising, does that mean we're falling? And my answer is clearly not, right? We can be off our game or on our game, but in a global economy that in the next 20 years is going to be 3 times as big, and 30 years could be 4.5 times as big, and just measured by GDP, if we're on top of our game, then sure, we'll have lots of competition in the tradable sector, but there's no reason to think we'll lose. Well, I sometimes go back historically. After World War II, the United States was really the only major economy intact. And we did great because we didn't have much competition. Then the Europeans, rebuilt, and the Japanese built, back up and actually went past where they were. And we continued to do quite well. And now we're going to have China and Brazil and India and a bunch of other countries, and they're going to build themselves up. And as long as we don't slip up on maintaining our focus on being innovative and investing in people, all of us, and creating an environment that's conducive to being open in the global economy and as competitive as we can be, there's no reason why we should lose. I think that, so what's that got to do with what I said before? What I said before, I think, is the immediate agenda for being on our game. Get the investment levels up and focus them on the things that are important, and we'll do okay.
We're here at a time when the IMF is looking for a new director, and what we're seeing is that the Europeans don't want to give up the power they have in that organization. What's the key here? You've been an administrator. You were a dean at Harvard. You were a dean at the Stanford Business School. What is it about power and being willing to give it up as relationships change? Because that's really the key when you talk about international governance. Do you have some special insights with this regard? Putting on this other hat that you've had as an administrator dealing with faculty?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's any great insight, Harry, but it's a fairly deeply embedded human characteristic, to want to protect the things that you have that give you some kind of advantage, right? So in a university setting, faculty are very, very, alert to anything that might be an incursion on their authority with in the area of academic policy, appointments and stuff, or the research agenda or anything, and for good reasons, but it's a very highly developed antenna. I think we in America are in a transition where we have to learn to think of ourselves as not dominant, not mainly focused on just what happens here. 30 years ago, if you wanted to know what the major forces operating on our economy were, they were mostly internal. And I think we're in that transition where that can't be true. That means we have to become more knowledgeable. We have to learn to think of these things as our both competitors and partners in the future. It's going to take a generation or two because people my age, have lived in the dominant economy in the world for our entire working life. So I think it's hard, and in the case of Europe, they have a special problem, which is they haven't fully formed the European Union, right? This is not like a country. It's politically decentralized, it's fiscally decentralized. It's a very impressive achievement thus far, and hopefully they will eventually succeed in the dimensions they hope for. But it makes them hypersensitive to dimensions in which they lose power. this is one, and they may be right that for one more round, a European of great stature like Christine Lagarde would be the right appointment. I don't want to weigh in on that. I think on the next round, it has to be somebody from outside Europe. But they have way too much voting power in the World Bank and the IMF. And, Belgium doesn't want to give it up. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we are.
One final question. How would you advise students to prepare for the future, which is already happening, and there'll be more of it coming along in this, what you call the multi-speed world economy?
Well, I think probably the advice is the one we've always given our younger people anyway, which is, maximize, the value of your education, with a focus on sort of curiosity and learning. And I guess the only addition is and expand those frontiers, not just to different types of people, but to people from all over the world. So I think that probably means language skills and a fair amount of travel. We were talking before, and you can learn a lot about the world out there by reading, but eventually, you probably just have to go look.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for being here. Let me show your book again, because I think it's, as I said, it's going to be an important tool in helping the public understand what's going on in the world economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. I enjoyed being with you.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure to have you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.